Now the Sahara, world's biggest desert. As we have explored the Sahara Desert, we have found buried in the sands a lot of their artwork, their statues. The dry desert sand will preserve even paintings and wood for generations, hundreds of years. It is now believed that during the last great ice age that froze over most of Europe and even froze the Mediterranean Sea, Europeans and everyone living north was forced south, and a lot of them are believed to have settled in the Sahara and lived in the Sahara for a good while until the ice age retreated. Then the Sahara Desert dried up. Then some people say it dried up owing to farming, over-farming the land. In other words, well, okay, let me clarify. The Sahara Desert dried up due to irrigation. Now, what's wrong with irrigation? The water that they use to water their crops with contained too much salt. And if you know anything about your chemistry, when salt water evaporates, the salt stays behind in the water. Yeah. So they used water that they got from underground that had too much salt, and after generations of this, the salt killed the plant life and made the Sahara Desert bigger. Then the Sahara Desert got really, really hot because the sun was beating down on that sand. And the Sahara Desert has been expanding ever since. And I've once heard that the Sahara Desert is still expanding at the rate of 30 miles a year, getting bigger and bigger. And anyway, as the Sahara Desert got drier and bigger, the people living there were forced to move out. And oftentimes as they moved, they left behind their paintings, their artwork, their statues, and we're able to find these things and pretty well guess something about their life. It shows them hunting. They did a lot of hunting. The land of the Sahara was once apparently grassland, had a lot of tall grasses, a lot of game, a lot of elk, deer, wild beasts, animals like that. And as the Sahara dried up, all these animals were forced mostly to the south. But at one time they had a lot of game. But before that before it dried up, they had a lot of lakes and ponds. Their grasslands are known as savannas. Georgia's second largest city, named Savannah. The word savanna means vast grassland. And if I talk grassland, again I'm talking about grasses that are as tall as humans are, very tall grasses. And I mentioned how that a lot of hurricanes form in the Sahara and then cross the Atlantic. Apparently these people made their living by farming and herding. Now, there was another group of people who lived along the coastline called the Berbers. These Berbers would trade with the people living in the Sahara. And then as the Sahara Desert dried up, the trade continued, but they had to start crossing the Sahara using first donkeys, then as the Sahara got drier and bigger, they started using camels. Carthage, a city that I mentioned earlier, might have at one time been the trading link, the link between sub-Saharan Africa and the rest of Europe and the rest of the Western world. That the caravans would start at Carthage and head south into across the Sahara. Carthage might have been the hub. In our own country's history, if you go to St. Louis, you'll hear that St. Louis was the hub between the Eastern and Western. That people who wanted to go west would assemble at St. Louis. For a long time, for many years, the last railroad ended at St. Louis. Then they went to Independence, and then the railroad eventually crossed the continent. Well, Carthage might have been the trading hub for trade with for Africa's minerals. The traders would travel in caravans. Several reasons for this. Caravan, hopefully all you know what a caravan is. It's many pack animals mostly camels and humans traveling together. One reason was to fight off thieves. If a gang of thieves saw a large enough caravan, they'd leave it alone, thinking that these people outnumber us. But it protected you from thieves, and also if one person on the trip got sick, the rest of them could take care of him or put him on a pack animal and let him ride the pack animal till he got better. They traveled in large groups. Iron smelting became a real industry in the south of Sahara Desert. Now, again, folks, don't try this at home. But in order to melt iron, you have to have a very, very hot fire. The air just by itself does not create enough oxygen to heat the fire. You have to use big pumps to pump the air, the oxygen, into the flame. And in those days, they used big, big bellows that were basically big pumps as big as humans themselves that would force a lot of air into the flame and make for a big, make for a flame that was big enough and hot enough to melt the iron. They used clay pots, and again, the reason for the clay is clay does not melt as low as iron. So you can use a clay pot to hold the liquid iron and then pour the clay pot into a mold using machines, not your bare hands, but pour the clay pot and form the iron into iron, whatever it is you were trying to make. And also, as the iron was melting, iron being heavy, the iron would go to the bottom, and the impurities in the iron would float to the top. If you know, again, basic fundamental physics, that in the case of water, anything heavier than water sinks down, anything lighter than water goes to the top. When you're melting iron, anything lighter than iron is going to float to the top, which is almost everything. So what they do, they'd get a clay shovel, again clay because it wouldn't melt, and scrape the impurities off the top of the iron until they had all the impurities off the top of the liquid iron. But anyway, this practice of smelting the iron might have been brought to Africa through Carthage. And then again, it might be something the Africans learned themselves. And this iron, once smelted, it was carried across the desert up to the Mediterranean world, where it was traded. In the Mediterranean, people used it to make swords, plowshares, spear tips, and armor, all the stuff they used iron for. Eventually, they learned to take the iron and make it into steel, but that was to come later. Now, East Africa, land of the Zanj, here is where that most of the trading that went on from Africa and the Far East went. And your book says it was the most lucrative trading that there was in the world, and it was helped by the trade winds, the winds that would blow east for 6 months of the year and then west for 6 months of the year, and the sea captains had to know when to head east if they were in Africa and when to head west if they were in the Far East. But the trade that went on back and forth from Africa to the Far East, and this went on for centuries during the days of the wooden sailing vessels. Monsoon winds, basically these monsoon winds could get pretty fast, and they could carry a ship pretty quickly. Now, on the subject, how fast did these ships actually go? Maybe as fast as 30 knots or so. And you notice I said knots because a nautical mile is slightly longer than a land mile, statute mile. I see one person seems to know what I'm talking about. You don't ever say knots an hour, folk. It's knots. Yeah, don't ever say knots an hour, because the word knots means nautical miles per hour. Anyway, you may or may not know, and your physics teacher can verify this if you want, a sailboat can go faster than the wind. The speed of the boat depends on how much energy this boat is picking up from the wind, not on how fast the wind is blowing, not necessarily. So your sailboat, because the wind is right behind it, can go faster than the wind. And in other words, these ships probably could go pretty fast, getting to the Far East, then load up, offload their goods, load up the Far Eastern goods, and carry them back to Africa. Again, the point I'm making is these people had a higher level of civilization, similar to the North American Indians before Columbus. But as time went on, their civilization declined. And then they became known as the Dark Continent. Now, the Bantu people, they began to move in. Now, I can't exactly prove this, but the Bantu probably had a lot more children per woman than the other African tribal people, which might explain why they took over. But they tended to be a tribal peoples. And then, by the way, the Bantu still exist. There's, like, I believe, still Africa's largest ethnic group. Bantu began moving into East Africa. And they did not live by trade, but they lived most by farming. And they were a tribal people. Now, you may know, a tribe is an extended family. They all of them descended from one set of great-great-grandparents. But in our study of DNA and genetics, we've noticed that there were probably a lot of people living among the Bantu who were not Bantu, because they'd either be captured as slaves or captured in war, or sometimes they'd leave their own people and go and join the Bantu, voluntarily join. So a lot of them, the people who called themselves Bantu, might not have racially been Bantu. But the Bantu culture was eventually to become the dominant culture of Africa, and Africa was to become a region of tribal peoples with an animistic religion and a lot of shaman, otherwise known as witch doctors. And basically their civilization came to an end, and the uncivilized took over. I want to say this by comparison. In the case of like my own ancestors, Europeans had a lot of uncivilized people living in it throughout centuries. For instance, the Scandinavian people were uncivilized for a long time, until the 1000s or so. And the German people were uncivilized during the time of the Romans. But what happened with Europe, though, when these uncivilized peoples began to move into the civilized territory, they eventually became civilized themselves. And but they brought civilization down pretty low, and Europe went through a period called the Dark Ages. All right. Islam moved in. As you know, Islam started in Arabia, which is just across the Red Sea from Africa. Islam took over Egypt. They took Egypt from the Byzantine Empire. The Coptic Christians welcomed the Islam because the Coptic, I already have Coptic, I've got to put that down. The Coptic Christians were the Christians of Egypt and Ethiopia. And when the Ethiopians converted to Christianity, they copied the Christianity of the neighbors, were the Coptic. I'm not going to go into the detail of what the difference was. It was a theological difference involving the nature of the Trinity, the Godhead. And the Coptic believed one way and other Christians believed another. So the Coptic Christians were persecuted by their fellow Christians. So they welcomed the Muslims in. And for the next hundreds of years, the Coptic Christians living in Egypt got along with the Muslims. That is, until a few years ago when the Brotherhood took over and Egypt had a big rebellion, and now Coptic Christians are suffering under the Egyptian rule. A lot of Egyptians became Muslim when the Muslims moved in, and Egypt is still Muslim to this day. The Berbers living in North Africa, they resisted Islam for a while, but eventually they succumbed. Now there was one people who did not succumb to Islam, and that is Ethiopia. Ethiopia has been a difficult land for outsiders to conquer. The Muslims never could, owing to several things. Number one, Ethiopia has a lot of mountains where the Ethiopians could use to defend themselves. And another, Ethiopia has a whole lot of venomous snakes. Your book won't mention it, but these snakes are a terror to invading armies. And the invading armies have found their soldiers bitten right and left by these snakes. And folks, somehow the Ethiopians themselves have learned how to, I don't know what to say, how to get along with the snakes or how to keep the snakes at bay, whatever, but they don't seem to have any problem with them. But as recently as the 1890s, Italy invaded Ethiopia, and Ethiopia defeated Italy, and it was a real embarrassment to Italy because hardly any other of those African nations had defeated a European country. But Italy defeated Ethiopia in the 1890s, owing in part now, not just to the venomous snakes, but to the mountains and the fact that Great Britain had supplied the Ethiopians with better weapons than the Italians had. So the Ethiopians went into battle with heavy artillery and rifles that were better than any rifles that the Italian army had, and the Ethiopians were able to drive the Italians out. But then the Italians came in several years later, about a generation later, and they had airplanes and tanks that Ethiopia didn't have. They conquered Ethiopia for a few years. And when Italy lost in World War II, they had to give Ethiopia back. Anyway, Islam was able to conquer most of North Africa. Then Islam began spreading itself south into the sub-Saharan Africa, south of the Sahara Desert. And they ran into several problems. Number one, it wasn't like they could conquer a nation. By this time, these people were tribal. And it's more difficult to conquer a tribal people. But another problem that Islam had, and this is the same problem that Christian missionaries have had. Yes?
Why is it more difficult to conquer tribal people? Just because there's so many different tribes?
Well, because you might conquer the tribe, but there are other tribes, and then the other tribe, there are other tribes, then there are other tribes, then there are more tribes, then there are more tribes. And it's just very, very difficult to overcome them all. And also these tribes can get up and move. I mean, the word tribal has a connotation of people who can wander around and get up and move about. That has a whole lot to do with it. Whereas if you have a big nation, if you can defeat the nation, get its king under subjection, then you've got the whole nation. With the tribal people, well, this is a problem that we had. The American Indians living in North America were tribal people. We couldn't make a treaty with them because if you made a treaty with the Iroquois,
it's different from
the Mohicans would not honor it. So if you made a treaty with the Swanee Indians or the Shoshone Indians or the Paiute Indians or whatever, the other Indian nations didn't feel. So there was no one you could actually make a treaty with. And this led to problems. Now another problem that Islam had is the problem of polygamy. Islam didn't allow the man to have allow a man to have 4 wives, but it didn't allow a woman to have more than one husband. Well, Africa allowed women to have more than one husband. The Africans allowed a man who could afford it to have as many wives as he wanted. And this created a problem for Islam because of Islamic theology. Now, another problem that Islam had was Africans have priestly mediators. They're called shamans. But a shaman was a go-between between the physical world and the spiritual world. Islam insisted there should be no mediators. So this created a problem also. So basically, family life for Islam was different from the family life in sub-Saharan Africa. Culture, you might say, got in the way. And a lot of Christian missionaries have gone into some of these countries and find that their culture has some practices that are very different from fundamental standard Christian practices, including polygamy. Again, there were long wars between Muslims and Christians. Ethiopia remained Christian despite the pressure from Muslims. And yes, Ethiopians would capture slaves from south of the Sahara and trade the slaves to Arabs. And trade slaves to the Egyptians and the Africans. Now, slavery has gone on throughout all of history in Africa, and rumor has it it's still going on in the year 2018. Supposedly, slavery has been stopped in the Sudan, which used to be a few years ago, but Sudan split into two countries. They were afraid the United States was going to come in and intervene, so there's the northern Sudan and the southern Sudan. They split off. But there's also rumors that slavery is still practiced in the Sudan. And yes, this even came up before the United Nations, and slavery is still practiced in some parts of the Congo, according to rumors. These stories are difficult to verify because you have to go there and actually prove that a certain person living there is a slave, and it's difficult to do. All right. So much for the eastern countries. Now, there were three western countries, Ghana, Mali, and Zimbabwe. And Ghana. Now, here's the story of Ghana. All I remember about Ghana was it was located on the western side of Africa, the western hump. It flourished for a while and then declined. Now, this is typical of civilizations all down through history. They'll come on the scene and then decline. I really think a lot of the problem is civilized people tend to have fewer children than uncivilized, and with the result that eventually the civilized are outnumbered and the uncivilized move in and take over. But it was a trading center. Again, Africa had a lot of goods to trade. Now, Mali. Mali is still on the map. Now, I had a student from Mali a few years back, and he had something interesting to say. He knew what I thought about the government helping the poor. All right. Mali became a Muslim country. And one day, the king of Mali, who had accumulated a whole lot of wealth through trade, the king of Mali decided to take his pilgrimage to Mecca, which all Muslims are asked to do if they possibly can. And on his way to Mecca, he would drop off coins to help the poor. The trip from Mali to Mecca was long. You're going about 3,000 miles across Africa. He dropped off his coins. This king came back home flat broke. And the nation of Mali never recovered from it after that. Again, an example of what happens when the government helps the poor. Any king folk is actually a very, very poor man, except the only way he can get money is to tax. Levy a tax. And so he can forcibly take money from other people, but he can't tax the people. But it's like the old saying, you can't draw blood out of a turnip. The only way he could tax the people, the only way he could get money, he had to tax people who had the money. He couldn't tax people with money they didn't have. But he came back, he was flat broke, and his whole country then became flat broke also, because, let's face it, kings have to spend money. They collect money from their people, then they spend it, and that's how the people get money. A lot of times they work for the government, work for the king, or trade with the king and get money from the king. The king buys some product that is made in the country. And so anyway, the nation of Mali became poor. Now there's another story I've heard about Mali recently also, that they sent ships across the Atlantic upon hearing that there was a land across the Atlantic. And finally one day, one of the kings decided, hey, I think I'll go across myself. Instead of waiting for his ship, he went and never heard from again. The ships that the Malis sent across the Atlantic, most of them never came back. Again, we don't know why, but unlike the winds the North Atlantic, which has winds blowing, there are belts of calms in tropical waters called doldrums, where the wind doesn't blow. And oftentimes when the wind doesn't blow for long enough, everybody on the crew will starve to death. And more than one person throughout history, more than one ship would meet another ship and find that all life on the other ship had come to an end. And all that was left by the time they got to board the other ship was a bunch of skeletons. It might have been that the disease broke out on that one ship. Again, people, even to today, 2018, some people advise don't take a cruise because on these cruises, a disease can break out on a cruise ship and spread, and there's no place to run and hide. I mean, if you're on a ship that's out in the middle of the ocean and a disease breaks out, a plague breaks out, you're vulnerable. This has happened more than once, but we don't know what happened to the king who left Mali to go across the Atlantic. And we don't know what happened to most of the crewmen who left Mali to go across the Atlantic. Again, like I say, the winds. Well, also, I just said the winds can be calm, but when the winds do blow, they can blow too hard, become a tropical depression, then a hurricane. And wooden sailing vessels cannot survive a hurricane very well. Hurricanes hit the tropics more than they do the northern and southerly routes. So again, these ships might have bumped into hurricanes, or they might have bumped into the doldrums. It's purely speculative, but the people of Africa did not wind up colonizing the New World like the Europeans did, for whatever reason. Again, the Mali converted to Islam, and they helped convert much of West Africa to Islam. Their capital was Timbuktu. Timbuk. Now, Timbuktu has an interesting history. My dad used to say as far away as Timbuktu. Timbuktu was far away, all right. You might say far away from what? Far away from everything.
Everything,
Yeah, far away from everything. But yeah, here's the story on it. Europeans would hear rumors that the city existed. So they would try to go there, and when they try to go there, they'd find their way blocked by a desert for one thing, and by natives who didn't want them for another. All right, yes, some of you heard the story. And this Timbuktu, yeah, you know about it? Timbuktu remained a mystery to Europeans for a long time, yes.
Is that how you spell it?
Well, this is the way I've got it spelled in my notes. Wait a minute. Timbuk. Buktu. All right, that probably is a better spelling. Now, eventually Europeans found it. I mean, Europeans had automobiles and trucks and airplanes and things like this, and Timbuktu could not remain hidden forever. So, but their capital was Timbuktu, and like I say, it's a long way from Mecca. It's a long way from everything. It's located on an oasis in the Sahara Desert, which is why they could thrive as a city. One of the biggest ponds or whatever, biggest springs or whatever water source in the Sahara is at Timbuktu.